So hello and welcome to this live Q&A. I'm joined by Jeff and Harvey. We are expecting Adil to be joining us as well, but I think he may have had some technical difficulties, but hopefully he'll join later. So we'll get started with this Q&A session. The first question is to you, Jeff. So the question is, what is the biggest roadblock to biomarkers being used for?
Would you repeat that, please? The biggest roadblock for biomarkers
biomarkers being used more.
I think, one of the biggest roadblocks right now, frankly, is the regulatory roadblock, is that we find that biomarkers are having a difficult time kind of having a standard created. There's a ton of biomarkers that are out there, whether it's serum-based or imaging-based or whatever. There are a ton of biomarkers that are out there, but we've yet to kind of land on a standard that's going to be acceptable. And so I think what we have found has been almost like the vaunted liberal arts curse, is that there's so many different choices out there that we've yet to kind of find something that the FDA can rely on for one standard to go forward in that way. And as I say in my presentation, I think that is a problem. We've got a lot of stuff that's really good kind of in its vacuum or in its area, but much in the same way we've seen that we think that combined therapies are going to be probably the path forward, most likely for NASH, combined diagnostics in this way. So the combination of an imaging biomarker and a serum biomarker will probably give us our best results in terms of diagnosis, in terms of screening, in terms of fibrotic state, all these different levels there. But to figure out which combination is actually going to be the one that the FDA will accept, that's a pretty huge firewall to get through right now. And I know there are a lot of efforts out there. There's NIMBLE, there's Litmus, there's the ALNIT process right now also. And so I think we have to kind of get over that hump. And it's kind of like herding cats. We've just kind of got to get everybody on the same page and able to in order to go forward.
Great, thank you. And then the next question is for Harvey. So my question to you is, how do you see imaging fitting into the future of non-invasive tests?
Hi, thanks. That's a great question, and I really need to thank Jeff as well for his presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I've been in this field for quite a while now, and I started off in academics, and then I've moved to pharmacy, and you get sort of, I think, wrapped up in doing what you do and publishing papers and putting graduate students through and doing all of these other things. And I think some of the more rewarding times of my early career were actually being involved in another group, the Alpha One Foundation, where the patient involvement really starts to play a role. And so I think that's an important thing to take into account, because, we're not just developing new techniques. We're not just applying these things in a vacuum. We're actually dealing with real people. And whether that means sticking a needle into their liver, which is, I just can't imagine doing that, or even putting some of these people inside of an MR, which is never entirely benign either. Even myself, who does not consider to be claustrophobic, I find that uncomfortable. And so, there's a lot of ways that this can go ahead. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is, what are we doing and what are we looking for? And I think the imaging techniques have come a long way. And we've got to the point where we're obtaining, I think, good and useful data, and how we can combine that with other biomarkers, and how, because at the end of the day, there's a patient on the other end of it, and we need to be thinking about them and applying that.
Hear, hear, yay, patients.
Thank you. Just as a quick note, feel free to also bounce off of each other. I know that I'm asking direct questions, but if either of you have anything to add, then feel free to.
Well, let me add something then, since you've extended the offer, and I'm not shy to opinionate on any given number of topics. I just want to say, absolutely with what Dr. Coxon is saying, that I think that that's tremendous. Imaging, I have great hopes for that in the future. As one of the things that we see that's beginning to be used when you look at the technology is the imaging beginning to shrink, if you will. And so, yeah, granted, I'm not a fan of MRIs and going into the chamber necessarily as well. I'd rather have that than a biopsy. But we're beginning to see, even at the recent ASLD conference here in Washington, that now we've even got some ultrasound technology that can be read off of your tablet, off your iPad. And so the exciting part of that isn't as much that it's just kind of smaller, but that can potentially scale. That could become the equivalent of a blood pressure cuff, if you will. And so we can really take that sort of technology and go into some of the most underserved populations that otherwise wouldn't have access or would have difficulty accessing healthcare in some way, and then be able to take that there, be able to get the results, and then have it backed up by a care pathway then that we'd be able to send people out. And so I'm really excited about this. I think imaging holds a lot of promise for the future as well.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. We have to look at barriers and what is the barrier to having people that are involved in this. And I think techniques like ultrasound, for example, may not be always the best, but they may be very useful, and they may have a specific reason that you can use them. And there's, for assessing the amount of fat in the liver, MR spectroscopy is probably the best way to go, but you're just not going to do that in most people. And so simple techniques such as ultrasound, for example, like that, allow you to actually get into the people you're interested in, allow you to look at where you're going.
Great, thank you. So our next question is, do you see imaging replacing biopsy in the future? And again, this is for both of you.
Well, honestly, I would say I hope so. Biopsies they're invasive, and it has been mentioned a couple of times over the course of the day that they sample such a small region of the liver, and the liver, relatively speaking, is a huge organ. And so do you really want to rely on a tiny little biopsy? And if it's going to be a barrier to going forward, then I think it's a problem. And so I think we're getting to the point now that we have some great non-invasive tests, blood biomarkers, imaging. And if we can use these and combine these and put them in maybe with a systemic or like a systems biology type approach, then I think that should be our goal, to move away from the biopsy, which we call the gold standard, and you can argue about how good of a gold standard that actually is.
I am going to respectfully disagree with that to an extent. And so what we know is that biopsy is really, really, really overused right now. It's dependence, the distinction between the biopsy in a regulatory environment versus the clinical environment is just incredibly disproportionate. I think we have found that biopsy is just not something that has proven to be practical, reliable, effective, in the ways that we need it to be for both servicing patients, for being able to be scaled for underserved populations, and for reliable endpoints in drug development and clinical trials. And so that would all seem like I would say, yeah, let's get rid of biopsy. But what I think is that we could promote and push technology and biopsy to come up with a better biopsy, if you will. I feel like biopsy has been kind of caught in this area now of we either go non-invasive in imaging or we just rely on this old pin the tail on the donkey, stab them and get whatever sample we can. And instead, I would love to see some more innovation in biopsy itself. I think when you look at other fields, if you look at breast cancer, if you look at any of the other number of cancers, you see biopsy is still used in order to gauge kind of staging and the level of whether it is metastasized, kind of, you see all these other areas where biopsy is still used in a very small percentage of the cases. And that's what ultimately I think would be most effective in terms of liver, diagnosis, and in terms of screening, is if biopsy could just kind of do what it does best, and which is, probably going to be 5% of the cases, as opposed to this great, breach that we have now between regulatory and clinical adaptation. And so could we do biopsy when another, um, medical examination or medical process is going on? Yeah, I think that's potential, but it's just kind of the randomness and the endpoints that really point to it. And we've been so very focused on developing our biomarkers, developing our non-invasives, that biopsy, it's kind of become a one or the other sort of situation. And I don't think that's the case. From a patient's perspective, we want the best diagnosis possible at scale. And so for now, that means biomarkers and imaging, and we've got to come up with that standard that's accepted in the regulatory environment. But I do think there's going to be a small number of cases going forward that right now is just disproportionate to how it's being used, but a small number of cases where biopsy will be helpful. I mean, frankly, regardless of our efforts in hepatitis, our efforts in NAFLD and NASH, eventually there's some that say we all work in liver cancer. And if I was diagnosed with liver cancer and, had the technological ability, I wouldn't rule out a biopsy, at a better stage.
Right. And in that case, you're talking about really a directed biopsy. So,
yes.
For example, in liver biopsy, liver cancer indications, or an imaging technique that shows you more regional information within the liver itself, then maybe a directed biopsy could be the way to go. Then again, I would also argue that you really want a specific reason to do that. And I would
Absolutely.
like to say you really want a reason to stick somebody with a needle. I can't imagine doing that. And it's my life's work is to move away from that. I was trained by a pathologist. I have spent most of my life doing radiology pathology correlations, and I would love to get away from the pathology side of it if we could. I'm not sure we're there yet, but I would really like to go that way.
I couldn't agree more. If I wake up in the morning and have a to-do list, getting stuck by a needle is usually not at the top of the list for anything I'm doing that day. And so would love to avoid it. I do think for diagnostic purposes down the road that will still have to be, as you said, a directed biopsy that perhaps could be informed by some of these imaging and non-invasive techniques as well. And so totally agree with you there, Dr. Coxon.
Great, thank you both so much for those answers. So this question was actually for Adil, but as he's not here, I thought maybe one of you could answer, or both of you, in case the audience member who asked it has tuned in to listen. So the question is, what are the challenges in discovery of the biomarkers that could be used in the clinic to replace liver biopsy?
So, sorry, what are the challenges in the clinic to replace biopsy? Is that, can you?
So what are the challenges in discovery of the biomarkers that could be used in the clinic to replace liver biopsy?
Right. So, I mean, I think in his presentation, he showed it quite nicely with his Rube Goldberg diagram. And the fact is that, we tend to focus in small areas, and we need to do that. We need to focus small and then move larger. And I think that can always be a problem, where you can find something that's really specific, but ultimately meaningless, or something maybe that's very general, but really hard to apply in certain situations as well. So the systems biology approach, I think, is useful because it's once again getting at a good picture of where you want to go. But there's still, there's a lot of barriers in terms of trying to apply one size fits all approach.
That's really well said, I think. I would only add one thing, which hasn't come up as much in the conversations today, but as we talk about biomarkers and we talk about imaging, ultimately, there's an aspect of it that is about interpretation of that. And more the field is moving and is excited by, and there's venture capital behind artificial intelligence as a mechanism for doing that. And so I think one of the things that we do have to be aware of, I'm very excited by, how AI can be used in the future, future, AI is only going to be as good as it is constructed, and that there can still be biases built into it. There can still be gaps within it as well. And so to be aware that that is a issue that, or a complication that may be coming up, and it may be in ways that we're not even aware of. We can be designing this with the best of intentions, but because of any number of factors or characteristics, whether it's scientific, cultural, racial, whatever it is, we could be leaving something out of there. And so that'll be a challenge for folks to engage, is to not accept the AI results as a panacea of that, but instead as kind of a living process that we continue to learn from and continue to move towards better diagnosis for patients.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thanks.
Yeah, if you have anything else, Harvey, feel free to add.
No, I think AI, it's hot on everybody's list of things to do right now too. And I think the more we get into it, the more we're going to find problems with it. But I don't think unless we get into it, we're going to get anywhere, right? We can just sit here on the sidelines and say it'll never work, but unless we actually try and apply it. And then I think that's where the systems biology approach, where you try and look at a big picture, I think is always a good approach as well.
Great, thank you. And then the final question of the day. So how are patients relevant to biomarker innovation?
Well, that sounds like a patient question. I'll jump in there. I think it's so often, unfortunately, in much of the medical field, that it has tended to be somewhat top down, if you will, that the doctor or the medical field engages, and they talk about being patient centric, which usually means they're focused on the patient in some way. And what I would offer, especially in terms of the sort of biomarker or non-invasive sort of development, is that instead that it should be actually more of a working partnership, if you will, between patients and the developers, patients and the providers. And by that, I mean that as these biomarkers are being developed, I think Dr. Coxon's earlier example of, I would rather have an MRI than go through a biopsy, but MRIs aren't always a pleasant experience. I'm not, as I said, I'm not particularly claustrophobic, but it's not how I would choose to spend my day necessarily. And it can leave one feeling kind of rattled. And for those that are more uncomfortable with that, it can be just as a difficult process. So to work with patients and find out ways that can be made more comfortable. Maybe there is information that patient groups like mine, like the Global Liver Institute, can be able, work with developers and diagnostic companies to be able to help develop, to make sure that patients are more informed going into these processes, but also for the companies, the diagnostic companies, to know that, well, if you tweak this one way or do this another way, then it could actually make for a better experience, which could lead then to more patients using your device, more patients signing up for clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would really encourage that patients are a part of the process, all along. At the Global Liver Institute, we talk about having a solution for every stage of liver disease. And often that also means that we want to have patients as a part of patient ad boards. We want to talk about, our experiences early on, and there are 1,002 negative experiences with biopsy. And so the ability for a patient to get in and actually work with a company that would be interested in a kind of a customer service model, if you will, as opposed to this top-down model. It all starts with a patient. It all ends with a patient. Let the patients be involved in the process.
Yeah, and I can agree with that, because as I mentioned earlier, in my history in dealing with the Alpha One Foundation, you deal with people. The Alpha One Foundation was started by a person with Alpha One disease, and he was a force to be reckoned with, and he puts a face on a disease. And I think that's always an important thing to remember, is that every disease, whether we're in academics or in pharmacy or whatever we're in, every condition has a face with it. And I think that's something that needs to be remembered.
Yeah, amen to that. If I may offer here in conclusion that, often we see patients engaged by these sort of endeavors of coming in for a MRI. We definitely see it in biopsy or other things, and it'll be the medical team saying, just come in for a couple hours, and they're pitching it as a 2 to 3 hour sort of procedure. But for patients, that usually means time off of work. It could mean childcare. It's probably going to mean, in some instances, it may mean fasting ahead of time, which could impact some of their other, co-occurring conditions as well. And so for patients to be able to work with the companies, to be able to represent their values, their challenges, their issues, can really make for a better product at the end of the road as well. It's as Dr. Coxon says, it's definitely putting a face to it, but there's a story, and ultimately we believe that there will be a better product that better serves the population at the end of the day as well.
Great, thank you both so much. I think that's about all we have time for today. So thank you again to all of our speakers and participants for joining our Biomarkers for NASH Symposium. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you at a future Biomarkers event. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Esther.
Bye-bye.